Ellen, I think we'll just give it maybe another minute or so and see if we pick up any more of the
Sure. Right
trustee.
now, you only have 3 committee members.
Yes, I see. I'm tracking as well. The trustee members, yeah. But 2 Joes, you're right? We do have 2 Joes. And you have enough. And there's Donna. Great. So that puts us at 4 trustees, Ellen.
That's correct.
We only have 90 minutes, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So Ellen, can you go ahead and take the roll?
Certainly. Trustee Kane.
Here.
I don't believe Jim Donnelly has joined, nor Lisa. Trustee Loring.
Here.
Trustee Alexander.
Present.
Trustee Cates.
Here.
And I know a trustee non-committee member is Beth Dobson. Non-voting committee members, we have Michael Scott.
Here.
Ray Rice.
Present.
And Jeremy, I think, is here as well. Yes,
Good morning. I'm here.
we're all set, Trustee Kane.
Great. Good morning. So we have 90 minutes today. We have a fair amount to cover. So I will keep my sort of opening remarks short. But today we are glad to have Huron back with us today as we think about and work to learn from the visits they've had to our campuses. And we are there are no expected votes today, but we do expect a strong and rich conversation that includes all of you. Just as a reminder, this committee, as all committees are open to other trustees and to others who are part of the board of trustees with staff. I will do my best to prioritize committee members for question and answer, but look forward to everybody participating as they can and as they're able. When it comes to asking questions, the easiest thing to do is to use the raise your hand function, which you find on the bottom of your Zoom. You see, I just put mine up. That brings you to the top of the screen. Otherwise, you can certainly speak up if I miss you, but I want to make sure we have a rich conversation today. And appreciate Huron being here.
Trustee Ames has just joined us.
I
well.
see that. Good morning, Lisa. Hello.
Good morning.
So I think we'll just jump right in because we do have a lot to cover. I want to make sure we do have plenty of time together. We do not have a formal break in this agenda. So if you do have the need for a bio break or somebody knocks on your door, which certainly has happened to me in the middle of a meeting, just feel free to deal with what you need to do and come back. We'll be here and happy to catch you up. So with that, Peter, am I turning it over to you this morning?
Yes, Chair Kane, thank you very much.
Great,
And
thank you.
Brenna, do we want to pull up our slides and we can just briefly walk folks through the agenda for today's discussion? As always, we want to start with a quick review of where we've been over the past few weeks, just to keep you updated on our progress with respect to the overall project timeline. And then we thought it would be helpful just to revisit at this stage, particularly following our fall campus visits, the guiding principles that we established at the outset of this effort. So we'll spend just a few moments refreshing our memory of those guiding principles, because I do think it will be helpful as we go forward to think through some of the emerging themes that we've been encountering as we've been talking with stakeholders across the state and across the universities and across the system office to think through those emerging themes in the context of those guiding principles. So we'll talk a little bit about where we were with respect to the themes as they emerged from our spring visits to each university, and then we'll bring you up to date with what we are beginning to learn as we wrap up our fall visits with each university. And we'll then talk a little bit about how we see those emerging themes and those prospective signature initiatives that the system might pursue as being situated across a spectrum of projects that might strengthen the core projects that might help take one or another university into an adjacent space or the system as a whole into an adjacent space, and some initiatives that might represent more transformative action that will take longer to realize and particular kinds of investments of time, money, and effort. So we'll lay out how we see those things being distributed across that kind of a spectrum. And then, of course, very much as Chair Kane says, we'll be inviting your comment all along the way. We'll then close with a brief discussion of the Unified Accreditation Guiding Principles. And the strategic planning guiding principles were in certain respects derived from those, but we'll take another look at those Unified Accreditation Guiding Principles. And then we'll review some of the NECHI outcomes and think about what that might suggest for the things we'd like to focus on, the things we'd like to have more information about as we head into the board retreat in early December. So that's what we hope to accomplish this morning. And so to get us started, I'm going to ask Brenna to walk us through our
Peter,
recent
before you try, I just
progress.
want to make sure, are there any questions about what we're covering today? Just want to make sure, see if anybody's got any questions. Okay, let's go.
Terrific. Brenna?
Great. Thank you, Peter. So we wanted to just briefly spend a little bit of time on our overall project approach. So of course, we kicked off the partnership with the University of Maine system in January of 2022. And the hope is to have a strategic plan that is ready for the full board approval, either by the May 2023 board meeting or the September 2023 board meeting. Over this past fall, as directed by you all, we had the opportunity to return to each university to continue the dialogue around emerging strategic priorities that we had in the spring, both in our spring university visits and in our spring Zoom conversations. I will say that the visits have been very productive. You probably won't be surprised that there's been a great level of candor, which we've really appreciated. And we're excited to share those themes with you. What we have begun to do and what you'll see in the coming months as we continue the conversation in our January board committee meeting, we've begun to put together a strategic plan outline. And that consists of a few key components that we'll talk through today. Today, we're going to focus on sharing the themes via that outline. And then in January, we plan to share with you a few options of how those outlines could all come together. We're also beginning to think about the December board retreat. So the third topic that Peter discussed just now will help us as we tee up the material and the conversation that will be planned for that board retreat. So that is a little bit about what we've been up to and where we're going. As Peter mentioned, we wanted to bring back to the forefront the strategic planning guiding principles that we aligned on in the winter time. I thought I would just highlight a few. The first one, be student-centric. This one has actually really resonated with many of the stakeholders in our conversations. They are very keen for this strategic plan to be just that, student-centric. So I think the point of resurfacing these is just for us to have these 9 principles in mind as we are beginning to think about prioritizing some of the pillars and the goals. I think be student-centric is a really good one to have at the very forefront. The other one that I wanted to share, just a bit of color commentary, number 3, align with State of Maine's needs and priorities in system opportunity identification and prioritization and implementation. When we have foregrounded the questions in our stakeholder conversations around the State of Maine's needs, this has really led to some really great ideas. And you'll see those as we look into the themes, things like the aging workforce in Maine, things like rural health access. These are needs of the state of Maine that have been brought up as, okay, this is something that the system can really get involved in and help solve. And then the last one that I think relates a lot to our conversation today, leverage unified accreditation as a tool for achieving system-wide benefits and adhere to the unified accreditation guiding principles. We had a few conversations on the heels of the NETCHI visit around the unified accreditation guiding principles, which is why we've included them in the third topic today. One president had the idea of actually taking the time now to update the unified accreditation guiding principles and add a little bit more meat on the bone to them now that we've received some feedback from NETCHI. But I do think those unified accreditation guiding principles really provide the bounds for what the system could look like in the future. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. So good thing to keep in mind as we are beginning to think about prioritizing some of the items that have come up so far. Any questions on this? Okay, great. So I know you all are probably looking forward to hearing some of what we've heard on during our visits. This graphic was actually provided as a pre-read to all of the stakeholders that participated in the fall university visits. So these 8 strategic priorities were the product of our conversations from February to August. And we provided these as a pre-read, both in this very high level format, and then also provided some goals and example initiatives that had come up in our process from February to August. And so during the spring visits, a lot of the focus was on ideation, right? We want to get every idea on the table. During these fall visits, for those who had not participated, there were some new faces. So we were definitely open to some of the ideation. We also wanted to test, right? So we provided this pre-read that had these 8 pillars, some goals and initiatives, and we really wanted to hear, does this resonate or does it not? And a lot of the goals and these priorities were underscored, which you'll see in the next slide. There were some that people reacted to and didn't necessarily resonate. So you'll hear a little bit more about that. Before we go into the fall feedback, we wanted to remind you of this strategic plan taxonomy, or the components that we see as the really crucial pieces of a strategic plan. And we've shared this slide with you before. But what we are going to focus on during today's conversation are the 3 items that are in the gold mustard color. So the vertical strategic priorities, we also refer to these as core strategic priorities, which are the distinct lanes of activity that are really going to help us realize our vision that we want to foreground. And then the horizontal strategic priorities. These are sort of cross-cutting areas of action. And then enablers. And there are different ways in which, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that some of these items could land. And so the point of our January meeting, we're actually going to provide you with a few different options of how all of this could come together. But this is sort of our first attempt based on 5 of our 8 visits. So at the time that this material was sent to you 1 week ago, we had completed 5 of our visits. We now have completed 7. Today is our very last one. I am currently at the University of Maine, Fort Kent. And so I will just put that asterisk over this, little Parthenon.
Brenda, just for our situational awareness, can you just say the 3 campuses that you had not visited at the time that you did this graphic?
Yes, so that would be Machias, Presque Isle, and Fort Kent.
Thank you.
And so with Machias and Presque Isle, I think I will be able to add in some of the color commentary in terms of things that did come up that are not included in the written form. And then Fort Kent is the last one today. So we'll be in a position in January to actually make sure that this Parthenon represents all 8 and to provide some different options of ways in which, it could be that a few of these horizontal priorities could become vertical. And maybe we want to really foreground one of the enablers to make it a priority. So those are different ways in which that'll be coming up in our next meeting. But this is where it's shaped up since after the 5 visits, and it doesn't look dissimilar to the 8 priorities that we presented as a pre-read from the kind of February to August timeframe. But there are some differences that you'll notice. And what we're going to do now is actually walk you through this graphic in each of the areas. So there's one slide on the vertical pillars, one on the horizontal, and one on the enablers. And we'll provide some voiceover to each of these. So first with the vertical pillars, affordability and value. This is actually a really great example of where the Machias and Presque Isle input has actually led to, I would say, a slight refinement that I would actually call this pillar affordability, value, and access. So in the first handful of visits, access wasn't as big of a conversation topic, and it began to come up really acutely at Augusta, and then at Machias and Presque Isle, it was underscored even further that the University of Maine system should really focus on providing access to a 4-year education in the state of Maine. And that there is a really big population of students that simply doesn't see a 4-year degree in their future, and that we should really spend time, energy, and resources investing in being at high schools and getting high school students to come to our campuses to show them that pathway to a bachelor's degree. Affordability, though, is something that has been really underscored through all of our visits in the past 10 months, that it is a signature strength of the University of Maine system that individuals feel really should be maintained. The value piece has also been talked about quite a bit in terms of, could the University of Maine system really articulate the value of a public 4-year degree in Maine? There's a lot of talk about community colleges and how the community college system is getting a lot of attention, both in the political climate and just in the news. And people would really like to see the University of Maine system get that same attention. And that we do have some private schools in our state that are taking some of our students. And so could we articulate the value and the quality of a public 4-year degree? Economic and workforce development. This one is pretty huge as well in terms of the amount of conversation that people are passionate about the University of Maine system having a big part to play in the economic development objectives that are set by the state. People talk about attracting new industry to Maine, or even creating innovative solutions to address Maine's transportation challenges. There was one Board of Visitor member that had the sort of out-of-the-box idea: could the University of Maine system partner with the state to create autonomous vehicle routes and system? Obviously, that's a very long-term idea, but those are the types of bold, out-of-the-box ideas that have been coming up. In terms of workforce development, from students, faculty, staff, people are pointing to this challenge in terms of Maine's aging population, and that we really need to create a system-wide approach to understand the needs of employers and align academic programs accordingly. And so ideas like, could we partner with some big businesses in Maine and kind of create certificate programs for employees through different different businesses. And so that's a really big one. The next one, student success across all.
And I'm
learning.
going to just pause you for a second. I see Trustee Alexander. Barbara has a question.
Please.
Just unmute yourself, Barbara.
It's possible that this dialogue that you want to have with us today is going to happen later, but it struck me, and I wonder if it struck you or how you evaluated this tension between the desire for a 4-year public liberal arts oriented education, how that fits with this constant desire to talk about workforce development, what employers need, 2-year certificate programs, getting people jobs. Somehow or another, we need to talk about how there's some tension there, and how we can deal with that.
Yeah, I think that the 4-year public liberal arts conversation came up a bit at Farmington in terms of that tension, because I think historically that has been part of a value proposition at Farmington. I do think that there's been a few other conversations about the role that the University of Maine system has to play in workforce development versus the role that the community college system has to play in workforce development. And I think there are some really thoughtful comments about there being a role for both, right? There is a need for all different levels of education in our workforce, and that the University of Maine system producing different certificates and different 4-year degrees and master's degrees, there are workforce development conversations that they have a niche in being a part of that are different than those at the community colleges.
I would also just add, I think it's an important point to raise, because we do need to define a sort of the parameters of the purpose of the University of Maine system, right? What problems is the University of Maine system set out to, best address, and where does it complement other educational alternatives in the state and elsewhere? And certainly from our perspective, as I'm sure for many here, and certainly many at each of the universities in the system, our belief is that there's a both and approach here. We don't want to pit different kinds of credentials against one another. We see a strong value in liberal arts education. We see a strong value in professional education. We see a strong value in skills development. And so one of the strengths of the University of Maine system is the capacity to meet all of these different sorts of needs and to support learners over their lifetime, because there are different sorts of educational priorities you have at different stages of your life. So we really want to be thinking about how this diverse set of institutions can support the various and diverse professional development and personal enrichment goals of learners across the state. But it does mean having a shared understanding of the purpose of higher education or the purposes of higher education, and not trying to sweep under the carpet, any disagreements about those diverse purposes. So it is an important point in order to bring everyone along with a shared view on the aspirations for this system. You're right, that issue does need to be part of the dialogue. So I appreciate you raising it.
Emily?
I see Roger.
Yeah. Thanks. I want to follow up on that, Peter, and Barbara's comment, because maybe particularly with policymakers, I don't know, but part of the case for the university, which does go to the liberal arts part of our role, is the case that the university helps train people to be good citizens, to be active in civic life, to be active participants in a democracy. That may not be particularly attractive to a high school senior looking to figure out what they're going to do. But in terms of our overall role, it is to help contribute to the democracy and thoughtful citizens. And I just hope that that will get reflected somewhere in here, beyond just economic development versus quote liberal arts.
Appreciate that. And that again is helpful feedback. When we do get to the point of actually drafting a strategic plan here, we want to represent the full value of an education from the University of Maine system. And we also want to be clear about how we're defining our terms. And this is not about vocationalization of higher education. This is not about the elimination of the liberal arts. And again, this is not about being reductive in terms of all of the various benefits of pursuing higher education. So you're right, while there are certainly priorities for the state that are economic in character, those aren't the only priorities for the state, and we need to fairly represent all of those interests, as well as, of course, the interests of the learners themselves.
Let's
Thank
keep
you
going.
for those comments. Yep. So just picking up here on the student success across all of learner segments. And I think that all learner segments is important because it kind of gives the nod to the importance of the adult learner population that has come up in a lot of different conversations. When we say student success, I think people are particularly they feel particularly passionate about improving the retention and graduation rates of students. So we know from the data book and from our conversations in the winter and the spring that the Maine retention and graduation rates are much below peer states and national averages. And so people feel as though that could be a system strategic plan priority that could then cascade to some local decisions, right? Because retention strategies at Machias might be very different than retention strategies at University of Southern Maine, for example. So those could be, the decisions about the strategies are at the local level, but having it be a core priority of the system strategic plan seems to be very important. The other piece that a lot of conversations contained was this notion of mental health. And I did just want to have a shout out here. We had a great conversation. It could have been one of the best student focus groups that I've ever participated in at Farmington. And they were really, really proud of the mental health services that they're receiving on their campus. And they had some ideas about how those could be leveraged system-wide. And then we had another conversation at Augusta about some software and platforms that they have been looking into that actually could provide a 24-hour resource and could be elevated at the system level. So that was really encouraging, just given the great challenge that our country and our higher education system is facing in regards to mental health. The last one is around academic and research collaboration. And so I think this word collaboration has been emphasized a lot in the past few months, and people are keen to collaborate if incentives are in place and if student outcomes really remain at the center. So I think faculty also want to make sure that collaboration is put in the right context. We had a lot of good conversations around, kind of some ideas about what percentage of a faculty's time should really be spent, doing collaboration. Some faculty felt like, 95% of my job is in my day-to-day, on my university campus, and I have time for maybe 5% or less on collaboration. But if we make that a priority and find ways in which that could be a greater percentage of my time, if that's what the system is striving towards, then that just needs to be a little bit more clear, and those pathways and time allowances need to be set up. But we did hear some great examples of academic collaboration in nursing and in other areas. So those are strengths that we can build on. Moving towards the horizontal pillars, and actually this some of these discipline or more subject focus kind of, aligned to both the economic and workforce development piece and also to some of the academic and research collaboration. So it does kind of cross-cut some of these other core priorities that we just discussed. Environmental sustainability and ecotourism, that one, if I had to choose one that people are the most excited about and most, I'm raising my hand for this to be a part of the strategic plan, it is the environmental sustainability and ecotourism. I think there is some great consensus that Maine has some amazing physical assets that could be better leveraged. And this notion that the unified catalog and unified accreditation is allowing in terms of students traveling to different institutions to take advantage of the place-based assets that are there. People really feel like environmental sustainability, ecotourism, climate, and hospitality. There could be, for example, a bachelor's degree that ties in all of those. And that could be either a semester long or a year long that, would recruit a certain type of student that is really excited about this notion of traveling. And that's kind of intentionally focused up front. So there was some great energy and excitement around that idea. And then, of course, just around research related to environmental sustainability and ecotourism, and that the University of Maine system could really be known for this. We heard about some committees that are already meeting related to this. So there's traction and there's a lot of strengths to build on. So that one is just very exciting. Aging and preventative health and rural empowerment, I think in some ways tie into each other. And of course, tie into the economic development piece very clearly as well. So, there's this notion that Maine is the nation's oldest state. It has a really high proportion of adults over 65. Could the University of Maine system support research, lifelong learning opportunities, and community health initiatives for the aging population and for all ages? I think the preventative health piece comes in when we talk about the strength in nursing and radiology and allied health. People feel like there are a lot of different pieces focused on preventative health that could be kind of put together in some way. We did hear some great feedback about an aging research initiative that was happening pre-pandemic, that maybe during the pandemic it somehow kind of fell off the radar a bit, but people talked about that. Faculty pointed to that as a great example of a collaborative research initiative that was working really well. I think the rural piece, most of the state population resides in rural areas. And so this clearly ties back to economic and community development. There was one student that had an idea about how to use the physical space at the centers across the state. And I understand that some of this might already be in motion, but the idea was, there's a lot of physical space at many of these centers that isn't being used. And could we have rural dental clinics and rural nursing clinics to address some of the healthcare needs in rural populations? And last, people, campus climate, and inclusion. So I think the campus climate, there is a sense that people feel very overworked and exhausted. That is not unique to the University of Maine system. That's something that many stakeholders feel in higher ed when we have conversations like this. But there is a sense that transparency and trust could be improved, and that it would be really great if we were paid market compensation for our work. There is a little bit of frustration on some of the shared services piece. We'll talk a little bit more about shared services on the enabler side next, but people feel overburdened by some of the poor implementation in just, committee meeting times 10, like that. Someone gave the example that their day, 6 hours of their day was spent in, Main Street triaging, and they weren't an IT person, meetings. And so it seems like there's a lot of meetings and a lot of just burden that people feel a little frustrated by. So that might be one that we, as a system, and kind of flipped on its side and talked about more of the encouraging piece of it. Someone said, what if the University of Maine system was known as the best system in the country to work for? So that could be a piece that we really want to decide to double down on and focus on in the strategic plan. Any questions?
Brenna, I have a question. Thinking about the sort of the 2 slides and the fact that they reflect 5 campus visits.
Yeah.
You do make reference to sort of where Maine's population is and ruralness. How do you balance, when you put together a slide like this, the varying input from campuses of very different sizes, right? I mean, I guess, do you understand my question? Sort of, you have all of these campuses who do have different populations, they have different structures, even in their current, even without a current existing system strategic plan. Each campus has, we talk about Augusta has more of an adult learner focus, right? The University of Maine has the Research One focus. So when you put together a graphic like this, how do you take into consideration the sort of where the people are, where the money is, where the current resources are, I guess, when we think about where we're headed?
So I think these themes have come up, interestingly, at the large, institutions and the small.
Mhm.
And I do think that as we're, when we look at the different options of how this all could come together, there will be some important decisions to make, because one piece that comes to mind, Emily, when you say that is, research, right? Of course, we have an amazing R1 institution that is a part of the full system. Research is a piece that comes up a lot more at the University of Maine and University of Southern Maine than it has in many of the conversations at other institutions. So one internal discussion that we were kind of debating with, there was research as one of the 8 prior to the visits, and now research is kind of tucked under academic and research collaboration. And that was because research simply wasn't, a huge priority at all 8, enough for it to be a standalone, one of these 4 core priorities. But the idea of academic and research collaboration did come up, at really all
And
7
that's-
thus far.
Is the distinction there that I just want to articulate, I think at least how I see it, is that that's why it's very important that within the context of this, that each campus also has its own strategic plan, right? We've talked about that and how each campus does have it because they each have their own strengths. What we're talking about here is, what is the role of the system across all of the campuses, not necessarily prohibiting greatness of some kind that's a specific campus greatness. I just want to draw that distinction, because I think that's something for us all to keep in mind as we do this work for the system, that this is not to be a limiting factor to the campuses and their individual potentials, but rather sort of that on the balcony perspective of what is our overall impact as a system for the state of Maine.
Yes, I agree with that completely. And I also think that we do want to make sure that each university sees themselves in this graphic. So it's a very hard, it's a hard balance in terms of how to make, but I would hope that, and I would love the president's feedback, that these themes, that you would be able to see yourself in this, because
For sure. Yeah. I want to go to Trustee Alexander
Trustee
and then Kate's. Yeah. Go ahead, Barbara.
building on Emily's question a little bit is it will two things. It would be helpful to us as trustees to know where you detected tensions and disparate information among the entities that you're talking to, whether that's campus-based or client-based in terms of faculty, student, and staff. In other words, finding out where the tension is, finding out where there is a need for the trustees to have a vision that resolves tensions or responds to tensions would be very helpful to me. And the other is that trying to take this information and help trustees and the system decide how we might want to respond to these themes has to do with a lot of policies that the system needs to come to grips with in terms of what role the system plays to allow all the flowers to bloom, as it were. How much is top down? How much is hub and spoke? How much, what is it that these entities see the system has to do to allow them to be successful? And they can't all be successful at the same thing or have the same level of system related priorities. It's just not possible. I don't think. So where can we help stimulate the uniqueness of the campuses? So drilling down at some point and finding out more about trade-offs and tensions and people's views of what the system should do to make all this wonderful stuff happen will be important, I think, as we move forward.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I do think what the role that the system office plays, and frankly, what the role of other groups across the system, the roles and responsibilities, that is something that was very clearly mentioned in the NETCHI exit report, and that we hope to talk about in this third topic as we're beginning to tee up the board retreat conversation. Trustee Hack?
Roger, I think Roger had a question.
Thanks. A little bit more of a nuts and bolts question, Brenna. Could you send us a list, I don't need to know today, about who you spoke with? If you spoke with particular individuals, or if you spoke with the faculty senate, or you met with the student senate, or what groups you met with on your fall visits, as well as the spring visits for that matter. So we'll have an idea of where this information is coming from. But secondly, maybe even today, could you tell us what external stakeholders you've spoken to in terms of state officials or elected officials, so we'd know where the information is coming from?
Yeah, it's a pretty long list, I will say, over the course of the year. So I'm mindful of time. So maybe we could talk about categories, and then we can re-up to the committee the list, because it's pretty exhaustive.
You know what, I'm sure you're exactly right. I would draw that last question. If we could just get it sometime after today, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, it does absolutely include all of the categories that President Rice just put in on each campus, but also a list of elected officials, public officials, research partners, business partners, other educational institution leaders, that was initially put together with the ad hoc committee and then updated when we moved to the full committee structure this summer, when we gave a more expanded list to our friends at Huron to do interviews with.
Great, thanks.
We can get that full list though to the committee.
Yeah, we can put that all together. Happy to.
And Brenna, can I just offer a quick comment in response to Barbara's commentary, which is very helpful. Again, I want to just note that what we're still trying to accomplish at this stage is to play back a synthesis of what we've heard. And a synthesis is necessarily to a certain extent, a summary and a simplification of all of the many different discussions that we've been engaged in. But this is preliminary. This is not what the final priorities, focus areas of the plan are likely to look like word for certain. But it's important to recognize that as we go through this iterative process, we are not seeking the lowest common denominator, right? That's not where we want to land here. So we absolutely want to respect the individual missions, identities, and value points of each university in the system. At the same time, the challenging work here is getting all of the stakeholders to understand that they have a shared interest in the whole. And that's what we're really striving to do here, is to create a system level plan that provides useful, functional, aspirational guardrails, in a sense, or boundaries or paths for future success to function as an incentive to and a guide for each of the universities as they continue to express their own missions, visions, values, and so forth. So one of the important roles for the committee to play in this, because it is hard for faculty, staff, and students to think at that system level, one of the important roles for the committee here is to adopt the position of thinking from the system perspective. And by that, I mean this portfolio of institutions and all of the impact that they generate. I don't mean the system office, that's included as well, but I really mean the whole totality of the system. So that's a critical element of the committee's work. And I think that that's something we'll have an opportunity to explore in greater depth during the retreat.
Thanks, Peter. Trustee Loring, Donna, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, in the list that you have, I mean, you say it's quite extensive. I'm wondering if you have places like the Wabanaki Center, minority groups, multicultural centers, voices from the minority communities.
In the external stakeholder list. Yeah, I think the Wabanaki Center actually has been highlighted as one that we should speak with. So maybe we'll defer, Trustee Kane, to you and have a future conversation about, if we could get a conversation with them.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the sort of, after you finish all 7, it's like, are there any gaps in the knowledge that you've been able to collect? And that would be certainly a good one.
Yeah. What I want to say is, you're looking at retention and graduation rates and that sort of thing. I think it's really important to get inputs of students of color. So don't leave them out. Thank you.
Thank you.
For that comment. All right, so the very last slide in terms of the visits from the fall is on the enablers. System-wide branding and marketing is an item that a lot of stakeholders have a desire for. So a way in which there could be an articulation of pathways for students and families in terms of the different options that exist within the system. When we talk with some students, a lot of times they don't really know a ton about the connection with other institutions in the system unless they're part of, some student government group, right? And so I think a lot of faculty and staff and leadership have the idea that could we have some system-wide branding and marketing that articulates the value proposition of each university so that we can really showcase those strengths and just provide that path for anyone to stay within the system. A lot of people, there's kind of a interesting comment that goes that Hassan's eating our lunch, right? So how can we not have Hassan eat our lunch? And just articulate the strengths of all of the different universities within the system. Financial sustainability, the way in which this has come up in many of our conversations is around an equitable funding allocation model. And a lot of people have complaints about the budget model and how it doesn't support equity in terms of how funds are distributed. So I think the strategic plan is seen as a hopeful way in which if these are the priorities for the system, that funding will be allocated appropriately. And that makes people feel a little bit more comfortable, but perhaps there is some deep work that could happen around the budget model and really making sure that people feel like it is equitable. In regards to operational excellence, there's been some great conversations about shared services. And it is interesting, at other universities in my 10-year experience at Huron, there is kind of an allergy towards shared services. I did not get that feeling in conversations. It seems like because shared services, services that are led by the system and are, either there's a business partner who's in charge of HR, who's assigned to that institution, there's dotted or solid lines. People understand what that means and they're not afraid of it. That said, there were significant conversations about improvements that could be made. On the whole, I'll say that there are a few deviations from this, I think, at certain institutions, but on the whole, people are pleased with how IT is working, but see improvements that are needed within HR and procurement. And when we asked about, what other shared services could you imagine in the future, people talked about institutional research and advancement. Some institutions talked about library, but then we had an interesting conversation yesterday at Presque Isle where we heard that library is, sort of 90% of the way there towards a shared services model. So that one might be, a strength that we could continue to leverage. And it seems like the collaboration around library is happening effectively. But institutional research and advancement, people are open to figuring out what that could look like at a system level. Governance structure and decision authority. I think this goes to Trustee Alexander, some of your comments, and this will we'll bring this back up in the third topic when we begin to talk about some of the NETCHI exit report. But the governance structure and decision authority, people are very keen to see some improvement in clarity and roles and responsibilities of, what should the system office really be doing? What should I rely on them for? And also the role of the Board of Visitors. There was some confusion with a few of those groups in what their role was and an eagerness to have a greater role in advocating to the state and things like that. And then last one, infrastructure investment. There was some conversation about just baseline physical plant improvements and athletic facility improvements to support student recruitment and retention and accessibility. So that was a big piece. We someone made the comment of, we can't focus on this fancy new thing until we, figure out the potholes that are in our roads, connecting our different buildings on campus. So that seems to be a high priority.
Trustee Alexander, go ahead.
I bet you heard about the soccer field up at Presque Isle. Second, more importantly, maybe not more importantly compared to what Presque Isle needs, but I was interested, did you ask folks what their view of the role of the Board of Trustees is? Did you get any feedback on their understanding of our role or their desire for us as trustees to play in this process?
When we talked through the Board of Trustees, a lot of the conversation went to this new Faculty Governance Council. And I think people are pleased that there is a faculty governance council that's happening at a system level. There seems to be some not universal clarity on the autonomy of that group and what their, I think part of their, some people's perception is that part of their role is to advise the Board of Trustees and share their thoughts on what would work at various institutions, but then bring that back to the institution. And because there's 8 different institutions who are on a variety of cycles with Faculty Senate, it sometimes can be difficult in terms of just nimbleness of how quickly some of those, really, and people acknowledge though, shared governance is messy. People said that. So I think they get it, but I think, the perception is the Faculty Governance Council is on its, 5th or something charter, and there's still not a crisp understanding. But that was the big way in which I heard the Board of Trustees related to faculty. Maybe that's because faculty are kind of speaking from what's important to them at the moment. But Peter, I don't know if any of the 2 universities that you visited, if there's any additional comments.
So at the University of Southern Maine and the University of Maine this fall, trustees were not a topic of discussion. So it has not come up often. And it's not a topic we've invited comment on either. Not that we've tried to steer away from it in any way, but it's not something that we've focused on.
Thanks. Let's go to Trustee Marchese, Lisa, and then we'll go to Ryan.
Thank you. Good morning. I guess I have a comment and a question. My comment is I know that at some point we'll get around to implementation, and the system-wide branding and marketing has been a topic of discussion for the 5.5 years that I have been on the board. And the implementation of that important topic is going to be a challenge. And I just look forward to your thoughts about how we actually get there, because it's just been such an ongoing topic for so many years, and we just can't seem to get there. My question is, can you help me understand a little bit more about your statement about the role of the system office? Is it about confusion about their role, or is it about they want more from the system office, less from the system office? I'm just interested in really what that is saying in your slide.
I think there's at sometimes confusion. I will say that in summary, most people say they want more institutional authority and less system top-down decision-making. So they want the system to convene and help facilitate, but they don't want the system to tell them what to do because they feel as though the institution knows best.
Thanks, Brenna. It's not really surprising to me. It's interesting. Ryan, let's turn to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to note my own, Barbara talked about some of the tension between those, and probably no surprise, but I'll note my own tension between, that very first one where we talk about affordability, which, in our system, since I've been here since 2012, is just a substitute for, tuition freeze. 8 times in 13 years or something along those lines. And so I just like to note that tension between, we want to be affordable and we don't want to even have conversations about what the appropriate tuition level is. It just needs to be flat versus, an hour-long discussion we've had since that first one about we need newer buildings. We need to keep our older buildings in better shape. We need system-wide marketing. We need higher salaries. We need incentives to collaborate. And, just to point out the obvious, that if we have the same amount of students or fewer students, and we keep the tuition rate the same, and we give out raises where the state appropriation is only able to cover about 70% of that if it's a really good year in the legislature, there's an imbalance there. It means you're going to be in a cutting mode every single year, and that's what we've been in. And yet we're going to create, or we're going down a road of, we're going to create this vision that these are all of the places that we need to invest in. And then when we don't have the resources to make those investments, and instead we're back saying, okay, how can we trim the budget again this year? Again, I'm not suggesting I know what the answer is, but I want to acknowledge that there's a significant tension there, and if we're going to be affordable, and if we're going to continue this strategy of keeping our tuition at the same level forever, we can't do all of the things on all of the other slides. So I just want to throw that out there.
Vice Chancellor Lowe, Ryan, I want to thank you for that. I think Ryan and I have done a lot of budgets together, and we always would talk about how budgets are statements of priorities, but also if it's not in the budget, it doesn't really exist, right? And I think that's going to be as why one of the reasons I'm so glad that Roger, who chairs the FFT committee, is also with us and on this committee, because there's an inextricably linked connection between the work of the strategic planning committee and the work that we're doing on the FFT committee with both our short-term and long-term budgeting. And so, Ryan, I want to thank you for naming that, particularly because we cannot allow ourselves to become disconnected from that healthy tension that's out there. Chancellor, did you want to hop in? I saw you unmute yourself.
Thank you. It's been a great presentation thus far. I do think that we are frequently asked to do more things centralized and frequently asked to do less things centralized. And it's one of those balancing acts. As I think many of the trustees, if not all, know, that we did undertake a advertising campaign this summer, quite frankly, led it, and reached agreement just recently to lead another 9-month campaign. In those situations that people ask us to do more, it's usually around spending more dollars. I think Ryan more than aptly touched upon that. So we're frequently between a rock and a hard place. If we do more, we have to take more out of the budget that would otherwise be shared amongst the universities. If we do less, that's not such a problem, except then we're not meeting the requests of institutions or faculty and staff at those institutions. It's a balancing act, and we always are consistently trying to find the right balance, and most particularly rely on input from the presidents to the extent that we can get consensus on that issue.
Thank you, Chancellor. Brenna and Peter, let's keep moving, because we do have a significant number more, still have more slides to go. I can see we're on 13 of 22 and we're 27 minutes left in this meeting. So let's keep moving. But thank you everyone for these thoughtful comments and questions.
Yes, thanks very much. And we can move through this slide material relatively quickly and then have some further dialogue. But so as we just push this conversation a little bit further, we want to note that if we think about some of these goal areas that we've been discussing, and again, these are emerging, preliminary, and of course require further refinement. And it is important to note, to Ryan's point and the Chancellor's comments, that a good strategic plan should certainly define a vision, an aspiration, a direction, a North Star for the system to follow. But also that strategic plan has to inform decisions about resource allocation. If it's not doing those two things, then it's not an effective plan. So there are choices, trade-offs, decisions that have to be made. And a well-structured strategic plan is going to help guide your choices, because you're going to understand what you've already agreed to as being your top priorities. So as we think about that array of priorities, one of the ways that we try to think about it is as a balanced portfolio. So Chancellor was using the word balance a moment ago. I want to use it in a slightly different way and think about there are in fact investments that do need to be made in the core, whether that's infrastructure or salaries or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are investments that have been, continue to be made, and will need to continue to be made in those areas. But as we think about the changing demography within the state, as we think about the changing workforce needs in the state, as we think about the aspirations of learners, we also have to be prepared to innovate. And so that means thinking about bringing new degree programs or non-degree programs or other kinds of educational services to learners across the state. That may also mean, serving different kinds of learners than we have historically. How do we get more folks involved in post-secondary education that up till now may not have been participants? So we want to think about diversification in those two respects. And we can think about those as, first being moving into adjacent territories. And then we might also think about things that might be serving new audiences with new kinds of offerings, and that takes us into a more transformative category. So we want to be thinking about having some distribution of priorities across these different sort of stratifications. And if we put all of our focus on the core, then we're really only addressing the critical issues of the present moment. And that puts us at risk of missing how some of the trends at play this moment will play out over the next, 3, 5, 7, 10 years. And that could put us at a disadvantage in all sorts of ways. Equally, if we put all of our priorities in the transformative bucket, those are necessarily high risk, high reward. And that's not a risk equation that anyone wants to take on. So we need to think about some balance across these. There are investments we want to make in the core. There are some logical adjacencies we can move into, and there are some longer builds that we should be thinking about as we go forward. So we just wanted to distribute some of the goal areas, some of the themes that we've been discussing across this paradigm, and get your reactions to that. So if we start with the core, there are a couple of things that we might focus on here. So again, this point that Ryan was just making about affordable tuition. We know that there are some positives there. We also know that that caps some of the resources that the system has available to it to support that innovation. But as we think about this affordability—
And I think, Peter, I just want to clarify, because I think Ryan's point was not what is affordable, is that we've not even been able to explore what is affordable because it's been held, right? I think that there's not even we don't have necessarily a grounding in what's affordable. Affordable has been defined for us by not changing. Ryan, I don't want to speak for you, Ryan, but does that clarify it? I just want to, because there's a difference between what is affordable that we, to our students versus the perception of what tuition should be.
Well, and I think also, and this has come up in a couple of recent trustee conversations, is the role of financial aid in that conversation. So it's not just all about tuition. It's a bad strategy if we're going to keep tuition flat, but then also keep increasing aid while the number of students are going down. And so just all of those things intersect, and we just need to be smart about it, or strategic, I guess, is the better way.
Absolutely. And of course, other funding mechanisms are also important, philanthropy and others as well. But one of the other key themes, as Brendan noted earlier, retention, persistence, completion. This is another important area of focus for the core. Certainly one of the ways in which we can improve some of the financial performance, if we have stronger retention, that's financially advantageous. Also a continued desire, as Brendan mentioned earlier, for additional academic collaborations. Let's go further with some of the collaborations we currently have. Let's move from pilots to expansion of those efforts, and let's also continue to identify new opportunities for collaboration, particularly those that are made possible by virtue of the unified accreditation and unified course catalog. And so those are some areas that represent continued commitment to and investment of time, effort, and where appropriate financial resources to continue to strengthen the core. If we think about the adjacencies, there are a couple other things. And so we start to see an interest in what more, because there's already quite a lot being done, but what more can the systems institutions do around online delivery of both degree and non-degree offerings? And so to what extent is there an opportunity to continue to build on the competence that's already been developed, but particularly as we think about reaching rural learners and also accessing all sorts of professional development opportunities for folks at later stages of their professional career. We also want to be thinking about those opportunities for the shared services that Brenna referenced, and how are there opportunities to build on some of the progress to date to continue to benefit from the cost efficiency of collaboration from a systems perspective. Also, as Brenna mentioned, the continued diversification of research, not just within the University of Maine, but across the system. That focus on the development of rural community engagement with the system, and also communities that border the state of Maine. How can those intersections, those boundaries be useful areas of activity for the system in order to continue to drive enrollment expansion within the system? And then also, as Brenna mentioned earlier, thinking about how those university centers and cooperative extension sites can function as vehicles, not just for continuing and professional education, but also potentially for other uses to engage not just with lifelong learners, but other members of the community in other ways. So again, these are all areas where institutions within the system are in one degree or another already active, but there are opportunities for us to, in a sense, take those capabilities and competencies and begin to horizontally develop those competencies across the system so that we can bring the right services to the right audiences across the state. And then finally, in the transformative category, we talked a little bit earlier about the potential for the system to be a leader in this environmental sustainability and ecotourism domain, and also the opportunity to partner with industry in the state in some very focused ways to continue to drive economic development for the state. And function as a particular role within the broader New England context, and also on the border with Canada. I will say that it is common that as institutions and systems think about this spectrum of core, adjacent, and transformative, it naturally comes easiest for folks to think about those focus areas in the core, because that's what they're doing day to day. But equally, folks do, look at the trends they're seeing, and they are looking ahead, and they are anticipating. And so we do have a good number of opportunities in that adjacent category. But it is a little bit more difficult to think, 7 or 10 years out, and to imagine with great clarity how the trends of the moment might play out in the somewhat more distant future, and to consider what capabilities the system might need to augment or build or acquire or further develop in order to be able to thrive in those future environments. So I think that there's still some work for us to do here in this transformative category. Happy to take those questions.
I got Lisa, go ahead.
Thank you. Peter, thank you for that. I'll be interested as we go on in this process about your experience in public-private partnerships and how that can be used just to help us financially, and just whether it is talking about, as Brenna said, the certificates, or if there's other ways, whether it's donations. I think I would like to know more about your experience in public-private partnerships as we go down this road, and how that can help us out.
Sure, and that's a great topic for us to bring to the board retreat. So we'd be happy to talk more about that.
Thank you, Trustee Loring. Anna.
Yeah, I just want to mention that one of the blank slate areas, so to speak, are partnerships with the tribes. And especially, when I was in the legislature, I wrote a bill that would create a Wabanaki Trail. And that was passed, but I didn't come back to follow it through. So that never went anywhere. But working with the tribes to create eco options for tourists or whatever, that's untouched. This state hasn't done anything with the tribes in that respect. And I think that's a great untapped opportunity. And I think we should, look at that.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
It's a good idea. All right, Peter, go ahead.
So we had a couple discussion prompts for you that we can turn to. And so would be interested in your reactions to what you've heard this morning, building on your prior comments. And so, you know, I think one question we want to ask ourselves is, based on what we're seeing here, are folks surfacing the right issues? And again, I think we've had some helpful supplemental suggestions from a number of you here this morning, but what other opportunities haven't we talked about that we should get on the table here? And you know, conversely, what sorts of revisions or tweaks or refinements might you make to some of what you've heard thus far?
I want to make sure that all the members of the committee have a chance to participate. So I don't know if Aiden joined, but Mike or Jeremy or Ray, if you want to hop in, but Trustee Alexander, why don't you go ahead and then we'll look to the group.
Of course. I'm trying to express this in a fair way, but from the trustee system perspective, we are going to need some measurements that are and desired outcomes and ways to measure desired outcomes in the short or medium term that would help us drive the development of the positives and the core mission that is to be decided we should pursue. And I am concerned about the ability to say no, about the ability to enforce efficiencies, about the ability to actually determine if we have the bandwidth available to us currently to achieve our core mission, and what we should do to make that happen. Some of the smaller campuses have desires and ideas. Do they have the capacity to move forward? Sufficient faculty, sufficient resources to actually implement ways to make them relevant and capable of existing and growing and development to achieve their desired missions. So those are more practical issues that I want this plan to help us achieve. And I'm not seeing that here yet. And maybe that's the next stage of discussion for sure.
Thank you. Can I keep going, or did you have a comment related to that, Peter? I want to make sure.
Let's keep going.
Great. Jeremy, go ahead.
Okay, I know time is precious, so I'll make this quick. So
I'm glad you spoke up. Go ahead. You're fine.
Yeah, so I've been formulating my comments, and it goes back to what Ryan and the Chancellor brought up, and it also is right in line with what Trustee Alexander just brought up. And I just want to share just a brief synopsis to show you what more kind of boots on the ground, because I operate more boots on the ground at a campus level. I've been here 15 years, and in those 15 years, we've taken 13 budget cuts in my department. Through the course of that time, our ability to support growth and excellence and new initiatives has diminished. Compounded with that, we've also had to contend most recently with inflation, employment issues, recruitment and retention issues. And this isn't meant to be a complaint. It's just the world that we're in. But I think we need to balance that against the path that we're headed down to make sure that it's in check with what the expectations are as we develop this plan, because Ryan brings up a very valid point. I'm not sure how we're going to connect our dots campus-wide over the next, say, 20 months until we get to FY24 and still support growth that's planned, at least here in Orono and elsewhere, and whatever may come out of this plan. So I guess the summary of my thoughts are, please, let's take a balanced approach as we develop this as to what the reality is that we can support at a campus level. We all want to do what we can do, but we can only do what we can do. So I don't know if that kind of sums up my thoughts.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's exactly why you're part of this committee. That was really helpful. Thank you very much. Mike, go ahead.
Yes, I think my focus is more on looking at, we don't really have a way of measuring how centralization has affected the campuses. We look at efficiencies, we look at, centralization as being motivated by efficiencies, but at no point do we have measurable outcomes to see how these have affected each campus. And I think that's a real important thing that needs to be built into the strategic plan. Because if we're implementing policies and shared services that aren't really benefiting, but detracting from our ability to deliver quality education, then that needs to be somewhat assessed at some point.
Thanks, Mike. Other responses to these thoughtful questions? I will say, Peter, one of the questions I had earlier sort of is relates here, which is that sort of balance between system role and campus excellence, right? And how do we make sure that what the system is doing is in support of that, and not, to use your words, not a lowest common denominator.
Yep.
Weight, if you will. It's sort of embedded in question 3. Other thoughts about these questions?
Would certainly particularly be interested in, particularly given the realities that a number of you have just been pointing to, the financial realities, the resource realities, the level of resources and readiness to execute. Not certainly taking into account those realities. And that's certainly what, for example, the data book was intended to help accomplish, as we set off in these conversations, was to help ground folks in an appreciation for some of the realities of the moment that we're contending with. Should we, in fact, given those realities, really focus on the core and perhaps a couple of adjacencies and defer some of those more transformative efforts? Or do those realities, in fact, create a more urgent focus on the transformative? Do those suggest that we actually need to consider some different ways of operating and collaborating in order to create a more sustainable financial future? What are folks' thoughts there? And it obviously doesn't have an easy answer. I don't pretend that, but welcome folks' creative thought there. Roger?
Yeah, Roger,
Thanks.
go.
I guess the answer is probably both, but to focus on your last choice, needing to be more transformative in our thinking, I think that's absolutely true. And coming from the perspective of, if we were again creating a higher education system in the state of Maine today, would it look like what we have? And if the answer is no, then why is it no? And what do we need to change potentially to get closer to what we think it ought to look like, given all the realities of historical trends and the history of how we got here, the function of each of the campuses in the communities, all the rest of those things. But if it doesn't look like we would design it today, then how can we be a little bit more transformative in our thinking to get to what it ought to be? And the fact that there are real demands on limited resources makes that even a more important discussion, I think.
Right.
Thank you. Donna, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, there's such a thing as beating a dead horse. And I think that in order to get away from that sort of thing, we have to start thinking outside of the box and be creative. Because if we keep our thoughts inside, we're never going to get anywhere. We need to move forward, and we need to reach out for other ideas. I mean, the legislature, we exist on new bills and new ideas and new policies. So, you know, if we as an institution can come up with some great ideas and ways to move forward, we can always put those in bill form or put those in other ways to gain some funds. So I think just staying in one place and doing the same things is just not going to work for us.
That's great. That's exactly what this is about.
And if I could just briefly add, you know, I do think it's important for everyone here to recognize that other states do look to Maine as an innovator. That perhaps might surprise some of you, but the Unified Accreditation Project is one that many other states are interested in. And so when we think about those transformative opportunities and doing things differently in order to arrive at a more sustainable future, in fact, you're already doing some pretty profoundly interesting things. The task, I think, for this committee is to consider, how do we derive the greatest possible value from those initiatives? How do we resource them? How do we push them forward? How do we encourage greater experimentation by virtue of the opportunities presented by Unified Accreditation? But I also don't mean to suggest that that alone is necessarily where the innovation should stop. So we want to be thinking about what's the next thing as well. So I do think it's important to recognize that you are doing some profoundly innovative things, and we want to make the highest and best use of those efforts and all the hard work that has gone into those efforts to continue to advance the success of the system.
So on that front, keeping an eye on the clock here, I think, speaking of innovation, should we move to the NETCHI portion? But I think this, for our future meetings, we want to make sure there's a little more discussion time built into this agenda, because we have an engaged committee. But I think if we can move to the NETCHI portion of this agenda, since we do know that it was something mentioned in the NETCHI report is our strategic plan, need for a strategic plan. Let's move that in that direction.
Sure. And thank you, Trustee Kane. I know we just have 3 minutes left, and really the point of this section was to tee us up for the board retreat. So I'll just quickly go through these slides and then just offer, for any of the trustees who'd like to reach out directly to Trustee Kane or to me or Peter to offer some thoughts about what you really think should be on the agenda for the December board retreat as it relates to this. We welcome that feedback offline. But as I mentioned at the very top of the call, the Unified Accreditation Guiding Principles sort of create the bounds by which the chancellor and the board have agreed, as we're kind of making a pathway to a future system structure. These create bounds for what it can really look like. And as we look at these two slides that highlight a few of the comments from the NETCHI exit report and how they relate to strategic planning, we did just want to emphasize some of the items that we've already talked about, right? That NETCHI pointed out that there's a need for greater clarity on roles, responsibilities, and decision authority. And that while collaboration is encouraged, there are certain things that continue to foster competition, and that needs to be addressed. And the faculty role in governance was identified as an area of concern and area of attention. And then here, this relates directly to Peter's comment just now that Unified Accreditation does offer some sort of tool for innovation. And it offers, NETCHI points out that it offers value through the sharing of resources, but that stronger system-led processes are needed to really realize Unified Accreditation's promise. So the questions that we've, pointed out here is, how much should we kind of present in terms of different models of how the system could look in the future at the board retreat? And would love your offline comments about, the best way to structure the conversation at the board retreat around, some of Trustee Alexander's comments and some of the comments that we've just had in the past 5 minutes around how we can create a structure and a model for sustainability for the system. So I'll pass it back to you, Trustee Caden.
Thank you very much. And I will say that is, what Brenna just said is true. If there are things that any of you would like, just send them to me, call me on the phone. We're in the process of planning post the final campus visit today, planning what the board portion of our retreat will be on strategic planning. But I know we're at 9:30, but I'll just take a second just to look across my screen and see if there are any closing thoughts, questions, or comments from anyone on the call today. Go ahead.
I think we need a discussion about the retreat, and we didn't have time today. What is your recommendation for how we have some input about that process?
Well, Chair Riley is driving the agenda for the retreat. She's obviously not on this call today, but she is working actively with some of the committee chairs about that. So Barbara, I'm happy to hop on a phone call with you, or actually we maybe grab Trish as well if you have particular thoughts or things you want to make sure you get out of it.
I just wanted to have opportunity to think through and follow up on the invitation to have that input, given what we've done here today, which has been extremely valuable to me.
I agree.
Absolutely.
That's right. That's right. Well, if we all have these last slides in our board book materials, and so certainly would be happy to have a conversation about that, as would Peter or Brenna as well. All right, well, with that, I'll say thank you to all of you and remind you to please make a plan to vote. Election day is next Tuesday. I'll put on my general hat. Make sure you have a plan to vote. It's very easy. You can vote early in your town office through Thursday. And after that, you have to go in person on next Tuesday, or you have to mail your ballot. Hope you all have a great next few days. We'll see you at other committee meetings ahead of the board meeting, and we'll see you at the board meeting in